Hey everyone, we want to welcome you once again to the KLC Preaching Podcast. My name is Jared Alcántara, and I am professor of preaching at Baylor University's Truett Theological Seminary in Waco, Texas. I also have the honor of being the director of the Kyle Lake Center for Effective Preaching. So I'm so thrilled that you've joined us for this month's podcast, and I'm also thrilled that we get a chance to have some special time with our guest, Reverend Dr. Timothy W. Sloan. We want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm grateful to be a part of this. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, well, you are the senior pastor at the Luke Church in Humble, Texas. You are a husband, a father. Some of our kids are around the same ages. And you are doing phenomenal work at that church and phenomenal work around the nation. And so we're grateful that you've joined us on the podcast. Now, what I like to do when we have time with our guests is just go back in time a little bit, especially since it gives us a chance to learn more of their story. So way back when, there's like a BC and an AD in your life. Talk to us a little bit more about, when you came to faith in Christ. And then, you're also a preacher of the gospel. So talk to us a little bit more about when you knew you were called to preach.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I grew up in small town Sherman, Texas. I always had to tell people 60 miles north of Dallas. You blink, you miss us, you're in Oklahoma. So turn around and come back. But I grew up in Sherman, and I was always kind of a church kid. But I was also pretty involved in sports. So you kind of had this really commitment to my faith, but yet there's this part of your kind of social life that at a young age, you may not want to really highlight that area as much. But many people knew how committed I was. I got called, I think, very early to ministry. When I think about the actual journey, I often kind of refer to what I thought I heard Henry Nouwen kind of describe as this inner tug, this sort of kind of compulsion to really kind of move in a different direction. And so that for me was something that was just always tugging at me. And I recognized that, the gospel was something that was going to really be a big part of my public life. And it's already a commitment of my private life. So then I realized that I was called to ministry when I got to Morehouse. When I got to Morehouse, I made the commitment towards the early part of my sophomore year. I made the commitment to the gospel. And when I announced that I was called to the ministry, I happened to have a friend who was our resident director, and he said, he walked me through the process and then walked me down to the chapel where I met Dean Lawrence Edward Carter Sr., who dramatically changed the course of my life. And to him, I'm forever grateful. So he's really kind of helped me to see a different side of ministry. When I grew up, I wasn't quite sure that preaching and pastoring was something that could be fulfilled in a full-time capacity. So I'm tugged. I'm kind of torn here, I want some social validity, but I also want to make sure I'm committed to my vocational calling. So I think it was at Morehouse where I really discovered this is something that you can fulfill your vocational calling. It provides social validity, but it's you don't have to always look for that space to fully fulfill yourself, So I tried in some capacity to fulfill it by going to law school. And when you do that, it's always going to be a costly endeavor. So ultimately, I realized that ministry and ultimately pastoral ministry was my call.
Yes, well, when God keeps tugging, we have to keep saying yes, right?
Absolutely.
And you were in law school for a season of your life in ministry in the great state of New Jersey, where I'm from, and you end up in seminary. So you end up at Princeton Theological Seminary. I remember you saying Dr. Cleophas J. LaRue had a huge impact on your life. Then you end up down in Houston. So you were in Sherman, Texas, where you're from, but then you end up down in Houston, hours away from where you grew up, at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, which is quite a church and quite a ministry. But then around 2002, you sensed that the Lord was calling you to say yes and to a call to the church that you now serve, the Luke Church. but it was a season of immense change at that church, and you had to lead that church through a season of change. So much so that I believe your first book is about leading through conflict.
It is.
So talk to us, tell us the Luke Church story. How did God send you there? How did you know that this was God's call? And then tell us about what happened.
Well, I got to Houston because of my wife. When we got married, it was somebody's got to move. And God knows I did not want to be in Houston, only because of the humidity, only because of that.
It takes your breath away.
Yeah, absolutely. But I am so grateful that ultimately that's where we ended up, and found Wheeler Avenue and William Alexander Lawson. Really, again, made a huge impact on my life and helped to really kind of help me understand that this was a calling on my life, and helped me to kind of walk through that pastoral calling. While I'm at Wheeler, I also worked at Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston, which was important because it's a nonprofit, and it starts helping me to see some important pieces that are critical to what I'm going to be doing pastorally. So while I wasn't all that excited to be in that space for the time I was, it was extremely valuable for some of the things that it taught me to be able to do. When I got called to the Luke, it is a congregation that's now 125 years old. It was originally in Humble, which is most often known for Humble Oil, which is now Exxon. And so we end up being pushed to an area called Bordersville because of we were put out of Humble during the late 1920s. And so then we in this area, small area for blacks only. And then St. Luke goes through a season of challenge and change. When I'm connected with them, I wanted to really make sure, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. It's not just an opportunity pastorally.
Yes.
When I get called to that church, they're a small church, very traditional, but I knew the vision that I was called to help complete. And we say that we take the best of the traditional, connected to the contemporary, to create this emerging or evolving model. It's been who we've been for 23 years of my pastorate. We build bridges for future generations. You hear us say that often. But when I got there early, it's a congregation that's steeped in, I think trauma is best a real good descriptor for this congregation because of the move out of Humble, and then also some challenges and changes it went through in leadership. The church burned down in 1990. And so this congregation was really trying to hold on to who it was and not want anyone to move it. So the church started to grow very quickly. The church grew, and I'm young. I'm sitting here just preaching. I'm extremely naive, but we find ourselves thrust into conflict. And a lot of it was, the growth of the church and buying property and now deciding we've got to build a new facility. And that caused some turmoil. And we went through all those different things that many churches do when they're trying to transition. And I'm learning conflict. And I think one of the things for me was, in the midst of all of that, was that I was too naive to walk away, even though I had an opportunity to. But my commitment was, I'm just going to simply stand. And I made that decision. I'll stand in the midst of all of this, and we'll just let God handle everything.
Yes. Well, we've talked about is keep standing,
Keep
right?
standing.
Keep
That's
standing.
right. Yeah.
That got you through that season. And I speak to many pastors who, have the emotional scars to prove that it can be really hard to lead churches through change. But God has blessed the ministry. The Luke Church has grown exponentially under your leadership. I know that there was definitely, through the crucible of conflict, God was able to do amazing things. Now, with this being a preaching podcast, I always like to talk to preachers who love to preach and preachers who love to talk about preaching, just about what they've learned along the way. So you did mention that you were young when you started at the Luke Church. So going back to, say, circa 2002, I don't know about you, but I'm glad that some of my sermons were not recorded in the early years.
Yeah.
But if you go back and talk to that preacher, that new pastor at the Luke Church, what would you say to him about leadership, and then what would you say to him about his preaching? What kinds of things would you want to encourage? Start doing this, stop doing that, keep doing this. What sorts of things come to mind?
I think first of all, stay focused on purpose. What is it you're called to do? We say purpose, vision. What is it that you're called to do in that particular community of faith? Be clear about that. It's to sort of write the vision, make it plain. Be very clear. And I think that was one of the things I tried to do, make sure it was on everything. But then preaching-wise, it's preaching the church through congregational growth. So it's not about preaching things that you think are going to be attractive or that they're going to be extremely exciting. You got to preach how you're leading the congregation. And so I'd probably go back and say to that younger preacher, be a little bit more consistent in preaching them through the actual transition and change and towards the vision. Stay focused on where you believe God's called this congregation to go. Look at exactly how you want to determine the diet of the church and be committed to that. Stay locked into that. I think that I oftentimes would find myself in certain seasons where I would transition and maybe preach things that I thought, hey, we're in a low season. We need to kind of do something to kind of push us up a little bit, and then it will get you easily distracted. So always trying to make sure we come back to the center of who we're called to be as a community of faith. And I think I also would tell that young preacher, one of the most important things is be faithful to nurturing your spiritual disciplines. Make sure that you're focusing on your inner life and developing a consistency of fasting and praying and taking time off and not always feeling like you have to preach every single week, but also making sure you're being fed internally in the process.
This may tie into my next question, because you talked about how you'd have some more intentionality and keep coming back to purpose around leadership. One of the things I love about preaching is it seems to bring together biblical teaching and proclamation, but also soul care and leadership, because it's such a public space in which to pastor a congregation, of course, but also lead a congregation into what's new. So my question for you, it may or may not relate to your answer to the previous question. As you think about preaching and leadership now, where do you want to stretch yourself, or how do you want to stretch yourself as you think about the future?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it goes to this consistency piece of, where do I want the congregation to go in this particular season, being faithful to preaching in that particular area. I've also kind of learned to really develop better rhythms, and that's important to me in this season. I've started it just recently to where I'm really building it into the plan throughout the year, that here's the rhythm, here's where every certain amount of weeks I take a break. I'm not exhausting myself. I know how I prepare. I know what it takes from me. So a part of that discipline about how I approach preaching and how I'm really taking care of myself. I guess we're talking about the whole soul care piece, but really kind of managing my own self in the preaching effort. So I want to make sure that I'm really managing that. The consistency piece to it, those are critical pieces to me in this season.
You mentioned earlier how sports was a big part of your life too. I mean, one of the things I think about is how some of the great athletes, they changed their game too. Is the first decade of the game and the second decade of the game, and they can't play the game the same way the second decade is they did the first decade. But that's all because they're playing smarter and they're thinking of ways to increase their longevity and be able to continue long past when they're supposed to be done, right?
Yeah. I'm discerning that I may not have sort of the energy that I once had, and you have to be aware of that. But also in this season, kind of changing a little bit of my approach. I did this survey a while back with a lot of the millennials and youngers, but also some of my senior adults, and asking them, what is it about the preaching ministry that you like, and what are some things you'd like for me to change? And, they were talked about what they'd like to hear me preach more about. One of the top ones was relationships. We'd love to hear you talk more about that. Here's the interesting thing that I heard. I heard one of them say, we don't know if we need you to really exclamate every sermon, that have this moment where you just have to go to a certain place. We'd love for it to be real conversational. And I get what they were saying, actually. They want to make sure that I'm being intentional with what I'm saying. But it's a different crowd. You recognize that this is a different generation.
One of the things we like to do too, as we have these podcasts with phenomenal pastors, preachers, Christian leaders, is we also like to just tell them about our listeners. So our listeners are going to be people of different ages. Some of them have preached and pastored a long time. Some of them are still in seminary. They're just starting out. But one of the themes that's consistent across age and experience is that pastors get discouraged. You get discouraged. I get discouraged. What would be your word of encouragement to preachers today? How would you want to encourage them just as they think about what it means to preach and what it means to pastor?
Yeah, well, if I think personally in things that I've learned is to the preaching ministry, bring your authentic self. A part of us attempting to be someone else, maybe in certain seasons because of comparison, can be extremely draining. So I think I would tell them, stay focused on your authentic self. Work to really develop your authentic voice, not be afraid of the way in which you are called to do ministry, and be faithful to that. Take care of yourself. Make sure that you're being aware of your own rhythms. Be focused on maintaining your spiritual and your physical health. But then I'd also remind them you're called to this. And when you know you're called, when you know that you're purposed, then whatever challenges come, you don't have to see them as oppositional attack. You can see them as opportunities of growth. And so one of the things I've discovered in my preaching ministry is that some of my most difficult times have led to some of my best preaching. And when we went through a season of challenge and transitioning the church and going through this conflict, I often tell people, now those might be some of the tapes that I wouldn't mind people finding. There are others I hope you never discover. But when we were going through the challenge and the change, some I felt like it forced me into this place where I was having to dig so much more, that some of my best preaching happened at that stage. So it's not that I'm offering an invitation to conflict in the future, and I would not advise any other preacher to be looking for that. But I would say that whatever you're feeling or experiencing, the tiredness, the exhaustion, the depression, what we're dealing with today in society, some of the challenges we're facing socially, that these are opportunities for you to solidify your voice, your calling, and use this as an opportunity for you to press in to develop more intimacy in your walk with God. And it'll ultimately show up in your preaching voice. So I think I want them to understand the importance of focusing on your intimacy, your walk, and then it shows up in the pulpit. I once heard someone say that if you don't meet the Spirit in your study, don't expect to see Spirit in the pulpit. So that's a big part of our development and preparation.
Well, thank you for reminding us of all of those things, that the need to take care of our souls, our bodies, and then also to remember that we're called. Keep standing, right?
Keep standing.
Keep standing. God is able and will sustain us. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Sloan, for joining us on the podcast. And then also, I want to thank you, our listeners, our viewers, for being part of this KLC Preaching Podcast. We're grateful for you. Please click like, subscribe, and please tell your friends all about us. Thanks again for joining us.